Is that supposed to be English? The billionaire slams his water glass down, his voice cutting through the restaurant as he glares at the young black waitress. Maybe you should learn to speak properly before working at a place like this. Every customer turns to stare, the silence heavy with tension. His expensive suit and diamond cufflinks catch the light as he performs for the Asian businessman at his table. The hotel mogul switches to rapid Mandarin, his tone dripping with condescension. Then he spins back with a vicious smile, pointing directly at her. "Try saying that!" he challenges loudly, certain she'll be humiliated in front of everyone. The waitress stands perfectly still, then opens her mouth to respond. What comes out will destroy everything he believes about power and who deserves respect. But right now, watching this public attack unfold, who do you think really controls this situation? The silence in the emerald table stretched like a taut wire, every patron frozen in their seats as the impossible hung in the air. Danny Foster stood perfectly still, her dark eyes meeting Alexander Vaughn's shocked stare with quiet dignity. The 28-year-old waitress had spoken fluent Mandarin with the precision of a native speaker, her voice carrying none of the hesitation or accent that Alexander had expected. Her natural curls framed her face as she maintained her composure, the crisp white uniform she wore suddenly seeming less like a servant's garb and more like armor. The wealthy diners around them began to whisper, their conversations a low hum of confusion and curiosity. Alexander's perfectly groomed appearance, his expensive charcoal suit, slicked back salt and pepper hair, and diamond cufflinks, now seemed like a costume for a man who had just been exposed as a fool. Lin Shengming set down his chopsticks with deliberate precision, his 50-year-old face betraying the slightest hint of a smile. Dressed in an impeccably tailored navy business suit with an understated silk tie, he commanded respect without demanding it, his presence both calm and authoritative. His dark eyes, sharp with intelligence, moved between Alexander and Danny, as if he were watching a chess match where the outcome had just shifted dramatically. The Chinese businessman had been dining alone at his corner table, supposedly reviewing investment documents, but his attention had been captured the moment Alexander began his verbal assault. Now, as the reverberations of Danny's perfect Mandarin settled over the restaurant, Lin Shengming's expression suggested he was reevaluating everything he thought he knew about the evening's players. Alexander's face cycled through emotions like a broken traffic light shock, confusion, rage, and finally a desperate attempt to regain control. His hands trembled slightly as he adjusted his tie, a nervous habit that betrayed his inner turmoil despite his attempts to maintain his commanding presence. Where did you learn?" he stammered, his usual eloquence abandoning him like rats fleeing a sinking ship. The restaurant's soft lighting cast shadows across his angular features, making him appear older and more vulnerable than his 35 years. His blue eyes, usually cold and calculating, now darted around the room as he realized that every conversation had stopped, every face had turned toward their table. The power dynamic that had defined his entire adult life, the assumption that wealth and whiteness granted him automatic superiority, had just crumbled in the space of a single sentence. Danny's response was measured, professional, tinged with the slightest edge of satisfaction. "I learned it the same way you did, sir, through study and practice." Her voice carried the musical cadence that Alexander had mocked moments before, but now it seemed less like an accent and more like a melody. She stood with her shoulders back, her posture reflecting years of carrying herself with dignity, despite countless encounters like this one. The other staff members, busboys, servers, even the sommelier, had stopped their duties to witness this unprecedented moment, when their colleague had turned the tables on Seattle's most notoriously difficult customer. Their faces showed a mixture of admiration and concern, knowing that challenging Alexander Vaughn rarely ended well for service workers. The emerald table itself seemed to hold its breath, the upscale Bellevue restaurant suddenly feeling less like a sanctuary for the wealthy and more like an arena where justice might actually be served. Crystal chandeliers cast prismatic light across white tablecloths, expensive wine glasses caught the illumination like jewels, and the soft jazz playing from hidden speakers provided an incongruously peaceful soundtrack to the unfolding drama. This was a place where million-dollar deals were negotiated over aged steaks, where Seattle's tech billionaires and real estate moguls gathered to divide up the city's future. It was not a place where waitresses spoke back to customers, let alone demonstrated intellectual superiority over them. The very foundations of the establishment's social order seemed to shift beneath the weight of what had just occurred. Alexander's recovery was swift but incomplete, like a boxer getting back to his feet after a knockout punch, but still seeing stars. He straightened his jacket and forced his face into a mask of controlled fury, though his voice remained unsteady. "I don't know what kind of game you think you're playing, but I've been coming to this restaurant for 5 years. I know the management. I know the owners." His words were a threat wrapped in silk, a reminder of the power structures that typically protected men like him from consequences. He pulled out his phone with a flourish, his manicured fingers already dialing what everyone assumed was the restaurant manager's number. The gesture was performative, designed to remind everyone present that despite this momentary embarrassment, he still held all the cards that mattered: money, connections, influence. But Lin Shengming's voice cut through Alexander's bluster like a blade through paper. "Mr. Vaughn," he said, his English accented but precise, each word chosen with careful deliberation. "Perhaps we should discuss whether our business meeting tomorrow evening is still appropriate." The statement hung in the air like a sword of Damocles, its implications clear to everyone present. Lin Shengming was not just any customer. He was Alexander's potential business partner, the Chinese investor whose backing could make or break Alexander's expansion into Asian markets. The power in the room had just shifted again, and suddenly Alexander's threats seemed hollow, his phone call irrelevant. The hunter had become the hunted, and the prey was now holding the weapon. The restaurant's atmosphere crackled with tension as other diners began to understand the magnitude of what they were witnessing. This wasn't just a racist customer being put in his place. This was a business deal worth millions of dollars hanging in the balance, with a waitress somehow at the center of it all. Danny remained silent, but her eyes never left Alexander's face, watching as the man who had spent the last month making her working life miserable began to realize that his casual cruelty might have just cost him everything. The irony was perfect and terrible. In his attempt to humiliate her for Lin Shengming's entertainment, Alexander had instead revealed his own character to the one person whose opinion could destroy him. The taxi ride home felt longer than usual, each streetlight blurring past Danny's window like fallen stars as she replayed the evening's events in her mind. Her small Capitol Hill apartment waited in darkness, the familiar silence greeting her like an old friend as she kicked off her work shoes and let her shoulders finally relax. The cramped studio space told the story of dreams-deferred textbooks on East Asian linguistics stacked beside unpaid medical bills, a laptop computer older than some of her co-workers balanced precariously on a second-hand desk, and photographs of her younger sister Maya smiling from every available surface. The contrast between her modest home and the opulent restaurant where she spent her days was stark, but it was honest in a way that the Emerald Table's gilded facade could never be. Here, surrounded by the remnants of her academic past and the harsh realities of her present, Danny could finally allow herself to feel the full weight of what had happened. The memories came flooding back as she changed out of her uniform, each piece of clothing falling away like layers of pretense, until she stood in her own skin, her own truth. 5 years ago, she had walked across the University of Washington's graduation stage, magna cum laude. Her degree in East Asian languages and literature representing 4 years of 18-hour days, work-study jobs, and a fierce determination to prove that a girl from South Seattle could master anything she set her mind to. The scholarship that had made it all possible had covered tuition, but not the emergency room bills when her mother's diabetes spiraled out of control, not the funeral expenses when the complications finally won. Maya had been just 17 then, brilliant and college-bound herself, until their mother's death left them alone with nothing but each other and a mountain of debt that swallowed Danny's dreams whole. The transformation from promising graduate student to restaurant server hadn't happened overnight, but it had been thorough and merciless. Danny pulled her laptop toward her, the familiar routine of her evening work providing comfort in its predictability. Professor K, her online persona, had over 300 students across 6 time zones, none of whom knew that their accomplished Chinese language instructor spent her days serving overpriced salmon to tech millionaires who looked through her as if she were invisible. The irony wasn't lost on her. During the day, she was dismissed as incompetent for her accent, while at night, that same voice commanded respect from students in Beijing, Toronto, and Sao Paulo. The contrast spoke to something deeper about perception and prejudice, about how easily people saw what they expected to see, rather than what was actually in front of them. Alexander's escalating harassment had become the dark soundtrack to her working days, each shift bringing new humiliations designed to remind her of what he perceived as her place in the world. His comments had grown bolder over the past month, moving from subtle condescension to outright mockery, each interaction witnessed by other staff members who looked away uncomfortably, knowing their own jobs depended on not challenging customers like Alexander Vaughn. Today had been different, though. His performance for Lin Shengming had revealed something raw and more desperate in his cruelty, as if he needed to establish his dominance not just for his own satisfaction, but to prove something to his potential business partner. The realization that his racism wasn't just personal prejudice, but performative bigotry somehow made it worse, more calculated, and therefore more unforgivable. Lin Shengming's presence at the restaurant had added another layer of complexity to an already fraught situation. Over the past 2 weeks, the distinguished Chinese businessman had requested Danny specifically for his table, leaving generous tips that helped with Maya's mounting medical expenses and speaking to her with a courtesy that felt revolutionary after Alexander's casual cruelty. His handwritten notes, always in Chinese characters, always polite inquiries about the menu or wine selection, had tested her knowledge in ways that felt more like gentle encouragement than examination. There was something in his manner that suggested he saw through the surface of things, that he understood the difference between circumstance and capability in ways that most of her customers never bothered to consider. The phone call came at 11:47, Maya's number lighting up Danny's screen with the urgency that had become too familiar over the past year. Her sister's voice, usually strong, despite her 19 years, and the chronic condition that had defined too much of her young life, carried a tremor that made Danny's stomach clench with fear. "The doctors want to move the surgery up," Maya said without preamble, her words cutting through the night like glass. "They found something in the latest scans. Nothing dangerous, they say, but they want to operate next week instead of next month." The financial implications hit Danny like a physical blow. The insurance would cover most of it, but not the deductible, not the time off work, not the 1,000 small expenses that medical emergencies generated like sparks from a grinding wheel. The weight of responsibility settled on Danny's shoulders like a familiar coat, heavy but necessary. Maya's condition required specialists, procedures, medications that existed in the gap between life-saving and financially ruining. Every shift at the Emerald table, every online tutoring session, every carefully budgeted dollar was part of a larger calculation aimed at keeping her sister healthy and her own dreams alive. even if those dreams had been forced into hibernation. The mathematics of survival were precise and unforgiving. Lose the restaurant job, and Maya's treatment became impossible. Challenge customers like Alexander too directly, and the job itself became untenable. It was a tightrope walk performed without a net, with no room for error and no forgiveness for failure. As she prepared for bed, Danny discovered something that made her blood run cold. Alexander's business card, deliberately placed on her uniform pocket, with a message written in his distinctive handwriting. "We need to talk about your future here." The words carried a threat that was both subtle and unmistakable, a reminder that for all her linguistic skills and quiet dignity, she remained vulnerable in ways that her education couldn't protect her from. The card felt heavier than its paperweight suggested, representing as it did the fundamental inequality that allowed men like Alexander to weaponize their privilege against people like her with impunity. Tomorrow would bring another shift, another opportunity for humiliation, or worse. And for the first time since taking the job, Danny wondered if her to endure Alexander's cruelty had finally reached its limit. The private meeting request came during the lunch rush, delivered by Marcus, the restaurant's nervous assistant manager, who avoided eye contact as he whispered that Maitre Vaughn wanted to see Danny in the wine cellar office during her break. The location itself was telling away from the main dining room, away from witnesses, away from the carefully maintained facade of civilized behavior that the Emerald Table demanded of its patrons. Danny's hands trembled slightly as she finished serving a table of tech executives, her mind racing through possibilities. None of them pleasant. Alexander's business card from the night before had promised consequences, and now those consequences were manifesting in the form of a summons that felt more like a trap than a conversation. She descended the narrow stairs to the cellar, each step echoing in the confined space, the scent of aged wine and old wood filling her nostrils as she prepared for whatever fresh humiliation Alexander had planned. But the Alexander Vaughn who greeted her in the dimly lit office was different from the man who had publicly berated her the night before. Gone was the theatrical cruelty, replaced by something more calculating and infinitely more dangerous. He sat behind the manager's desk as if it belonged to him, his expensive suit immaculate despite the basement setting, his pale eyes studying her with the intensity of a predator evaluating prey. "Miss Foster," he began, his voice smooth as silk and twice as dangerous. "I think we both know that last night was unfortunate for both of us." The words carried implications that made her skin crawl, suggesting as they did that her competence was somehow a problem to be solved rather than a skill to be respected. His fingers drummed against the desk's mahogany surface, the sound rhythmic and hypnotic, like a countdown to something she didn't want to imagine. "I've been thinking about your remarkable linguistic abilities," Alexander continued, leaning forward with an intimacy that made the small room feel even smaller. "Such talents shouldn't be wasted on serving tables, don't you think? A woman with your capabilities could be very valuable to the right employer." The offer hung in the air like smoke, beautiful and toxic, promising advancement while threatening destruction. He spoke of protection from management complaints, of better shifts, of opportunities for someone willing to help him prepare for important international meetings. The subtext was clear as crystal: cooperate with whatever scheme he had planned, or face the consequences of challenging a man whose wealth could destroy her career with a phone call. His smile never reached his eyes, and Danny understood that she was being recruited for something that would compromise her integrity in exchange for temporary safety. The realization that Alexander saw her intelligence as a tool to be exploited rather than a threat to be eliminated was somehow worse than his previous open hostility. She found herself agreeing to his proposal, her voice steady despite the nausea rising in her throat, knowing that playing along was the only way to understand the full scope of his plans. "I appreciate the opportunity, Mr. Vaughn," she heard herself saying, the words tasting like ash in her mouth. "I'd be happy to help with your international business." His satisfaction was immediate and disgusting. His assumption that money and power could purchase compliance, revealing everything she needed to know about his character. As he outlined his expectations, translation services, cultural consulting, assistance with document preparation, Dani began to see the architecture of a larger deception, one that would use her skills to defraud investors like Lin Shengming. The conversation that had brought Lin Shengming to the Emerald Table became clear as Alexander explained his vision for expanding his hotel empire into Asian markets. The Chinese businessman represented access to capital and connections that could transform Alexander's regional success into international dominance. But the partnership required trust, respect, and cultural sensitivity, qualities that Alexander possessed in roughly the same quantities as unicorns possessed reality. His plan was breathtakingly simple and morally bankrupt. Use Dani's language skills to present himself as culturally aware and internationally sophisticated, while concealing his true nature long enough to secure Lin Shengming's investment. The dinner meeting scheduled for tomorrow night would be Alexander's audition for partnership, with Dani serving as both translator and unwitting accomplice to what amounted to elaborate fraud. Access to Alexander's briefcase came easier than expected, his arrogance making him careless with documents that revealed the true state of his business empire. While he stepped away to take a phone call, Dani photographed page after page of financial statements that painted a picture of systematic deception stretching back years. The hotel chain that Alexander presented as a paragon of luxury hospitality was revealed to be a house of cards built on inflated occupancy rates, fabricated customer reviews, and accounting practices that would have made Enron executives blush. Worse still were the internal memos discussing cultural adjustments for international guests' euphemisms for overcharging foreign investors while providing substandard service. The evidence was damning and comprehensive, a roadmap of exactly how Alexander planned to defraud Lin Shengming and countless others who had the misfortune of trusting him. The weight of what she had discovered pressed down on Dani like a physical force as she returned to her shift, serving lunch to customers who had no idea that their pleasant meal was taking place above a basement where international fraud was being planned with their tax dollars and investment portfolios. Every smile she forced, every order she took, every "yes, sir," and "right away" felt like complicity in a system that allowed men like Alexander to prosper, while people like her struggled for basic dignity. The photographs on her phone represented enough evidence to destroy Alexander's reputation and save Lin Shengming from a costly mistake. But using them would require courage she wasn't sure she possessed, and resources she definitely didn't have. The mathematics of survival had always been complex, but now they included variables like justice, integrity, and the kind of moral courage that textbooks celebrated, but real life rarely rewarded. Lin Shengming arrived early for what everyone assumed would be a routine business dinner, but his timing meant that he walked into the Emerald Table just as Dani emerged from the wine cellar, Alexander's briefcase still in her hands, and guilt written across her face like a confession. The Chinese businessman's dark eyes took in the scene, with the swift comprehension of someone accustomed to reading situations quickly and accurately. For a moment that stretched like eternity, the three of them stood frozen in a tableau that captured the evening's true power dynamics: the fraudulent billionaire, the exploited waitress, and the intended victim, who might not be as naive as he appeared. The expected confrontation never came. Instead of exposing her presence in Alexander's private meeting space, Lin Shengming simply nodded politely and moved toward his usual corner table. his expression revealing nothing of what he might have witnessed or understood. Danny's heart hammered against her ribs as she returned the briefcase to its original position, her mind racing to process what had just occurred. The Chinese businessman's reaction, or lack thereof, suggested either remarkable discretion or a level of awareness that ran deeper than anyone suspected. As she resumed her duties, serving appetizers to tables full of Seattle's financial elite, she caught glimpses of Lin Shengming reviewing documents with the same methodical precision she had observed over the past 2 weeks. His presence somehow more significant now that she understood the stakes of tomorrow's dinner meeting. The evening shift provided ample opportunity for observation and reflection, each interaction with customers offering a masterclass in the performance of power and privilege. Alexander held court at his regular table, regaling his dinner companions with stories of international business conquests, while casually demeaning the staff with the unconscious cruelty of someone who had never questioned his right to do so. His behavior toward Danny had shifted subtly since their basement meeting, his orders delivered with the proprietary satisfaction of someone who believed he had successfully purchased loyalty. The other servers noticed the change, their glances carrying questions they dared not voice aloud, understanding instinctively that challenging Alexander's treatment of their colleague could result in their own termination. The restaurant's carefully maintained atmosphere of refined civility barely concealed the underlying brutality of its social dynamics. Research consumed Danny's late evening hours, her laptop glowing in the darkness of her apartment as she dove deep into Alexander's business history. What she discovered was a pattern of exploitation that stretched back to his earliest ventures, a consistent thread of taking advantage of those who trusted him. Local news archives revealed complaints from former employees about wage theft and workplace discrimination, while business journals documented his aggressive tactics against smaller competitors. Most damning were the testimonials from international partners who described elaborate presentations that promised luxury experiences, but delivered mediocre accommodations at premium prices. Alexander's success wasn't built on excellence or innovation. It was constructed from the systematic manipulation of people who believed in his promises until reality proved them wrong. The evidence painted a picture of a man who viewed other human beings as resources to be extracted rather than partners to be respected. Maya's voice carried a forced cheerfulness when she called with updates about her surgery scheduling, her words carefully chosen to minimize worry while conveying essential information. The procedure had been moved to the following week, requiring a payment plan that would stretch Danny's finances beyond their breaking point unless something changed dramatically in their circumstances. Her sister's courage in the face of medical uncertainty served as both inspiration and reminder of what was truly at stake. Not just Danny's job or dignity, but her family's future and her ability to protect the person who mattered most in her world. The conversation ended with Maya's usual encouragement about Danny's big brain and special gifts, words that carried new weight now that those gifts had become central to a moral crisis that could determine their family's fate. The decision crystallized slowly, like a photograph developing in chemical solution, each detail becoming clearer until the complete picture emerged with startling clarity. Alexander's plan depended on Lin Shengming's trust, which in turn relied on cultural performance that Alexander could never authentically deliver. But what if the performance itself became the trap? What if Lin Shengming's apparent naivety was actually strategic patience? And what if Danny's cooperation could serve justice rather than fraud? The risks were enormous. Alexander's wealth and connections could destroy her career in hospitality permanently, while challenging him publicly might result in immediate termination and financial catastrophe. Yet the alternative, becoming complicit in international fraud, while her linguistic abilities were weaponized against an innocent investor, felt like a betrayal of everything her education had taught her about using knowledge responsibly. Lin Shengming's request for her assistance with menu translations provided the perfect opportunity for a conversation that neither of them acknowledged as anything more than customer service. His questions about wine pairings led naturally to discussions of regional preferences, which evolved into observations about cultural differences in business practices. Throughout their exchange, conducted in careful English, sprinkled with occasional Chinese phrases, Danny sensed that they were communicating on multiple levels simultaneously. His comments about the importance of trust in international partnerships seemed directed as much at her as at the general principle, while his observations about the value of authentic cultural understanding carried implications that reached far beyond restaurant recommendations. By the conversation's end, she understood that tomorrow night's dinner would be far more complex than Alexander realized. The final hours of her shift passed in a haze of routine tasks performed with mechanical precision, while her mind grappled with the magnitude of what she was contemplating. Serving dessert to tables full of venture capitalists and tech entrepreneurs, she wondered how many of them had built their fortunes through genuine innovation versus skillful manipulation of others' trust. Alexander's casual racism and cultural condescension weren't aberrations in this world. They were features of a system that rewarded exploitation while punishing those who dared to challenge its fundamental assumptions. The decision to risk everything for the sake of justice felt simultaneously heroic and foolish, but it also felt inevitable in a way that suggested she had been moving toward this moment for longer than she realized. Walking home through Capitol Hill's quiet streets, Danny allowed herself to imagine a different outcome for tomorrow night's dinner meeting. Instead of watching silently while Alexander defrauded an innocent investor, she could use her position to expose the truth and protect someone who had shown her more respect in 2 weeks than Alexander had managed in 2 months. The path forward remained unclear and dangerous, but for the first time since taking the job at the Emerald Table, she felt like an active participant in her own story rather than a victim of circumstances beyond her control. Tomorrow would bring either vindication or destruction, but at least it would be her choice that determined which outcome emerged from the carefully laid plans of men who had underestimated her completely. The private dining room at the Emerald Table had been transformed for the evening's performance, its mahogany panels gleaming under carefully positioned lighting that cast everything in warm, golden tones designed to suggest prosperity and tradition. Alexander arrived 30 minutes early, his nervous energy barely contained beneath his perfectly pressed dinner jacket, as he reviewed notes and adjusted place settings with the obsessive precision of someone whose entire future depended on the next few hours. The hired translator, a nervous young man, whose credentials seemed to consist primarily of a semester abroad in Shanghai, shuffled through his papers, while Alexander explained exactly how certain phrases should be rendered, his instructions revealing more about his prejudices than his linguistic knowledge. Danny moved through her serving duties with practiced efficiency, her presence so unremarkable to Alexander that he discussed his strategy openly, as if she were a piece of furniture rather than a human being capable of understanding every word. Lin Shengming entered the dining room with the quiet authority of someone accustomed to being the most important person in any space he occupied, his dark suit impeccably tailored, and his manner suggesting both wealth and wisdom earned through decades of successful negotiations. The Chinese businessman's greeting to Alexander was polite but reserved, his handshake firm without being aggressive, his smile professional without reaching his eyes. As they settled into their seats, Danny noticed the subtle way Lin Shengming's gaze took inventory of the room's occupants, his attention lingering for just a moment longer on her face than would be expected for casual acknowledgement of service staff. The translator began his work immediately, his Mandarin heavily accented and grammatically imprecise, but adequate enough for basic communication that wouldn't reveal the depth of his incompetence until more complex negotiations began. Alexander's presentation began with characteristic confidence, his voice filling the intimate space as he described his vision for luxury hospitality across Asian markets, with the enthusiasm of a true believer in his own mythology. The financial documents he spread across the table told a story of consistent growth and satisfied customers. Each graph and chart carefully crafted to suggest stability and success that existed more in imagination than reality. Through the translator's halting Mandarin, Alexander painted himself as a cultural bridge builder, someone who understood the delicate balance between Western comfort and Eastern aesthetic sensibility. His performance was polished and convincing, the product of countless similar presentations delivered to investors who had learned too late that Alexander's promises were more beautiful than his actual properties. The evening's first crack appeared when Alexander began discussing his staff management philosophy, his words revealing the condescension that he could never quite suppress even when trying to impress potential partners. The key to successful international hospitality, he explained, while glancing dismissively at Danny as she refilled water glasses, is maintaining proper standards while working with local talent that may not initially understand what quality service requires. The translator struggled with the nuanced insult, his rendering losing both the subtle cruelty and the cultural arrogance that made Alexander's comment so revealing. Lin Shangming's expression remained neutral, but Danny caught the slight tightening around his eyes that suggested he was beginning to see past Alexander's carefully constructed facade to the ugliness beneath. The transformation from polite business discussion to cultural performance art occurred gradually, Alexander's confidence growing with each glass of wine until his natural prejudices began bleeding through his professional polish. His comments about American workers became increasingly pointed, his language shifting from diplomatic euphemism to barely disguised contempt as he described the challenges of managing employees who lacked what he termed traditional work ethic. The translator's discomfort was visible as he attempted to soften Alexander's words. But the essential message remained clear. Alexander viewed his staff as problems to be solved rather than people to be respected. Lin Shengming's questions became more pointed in response. His inquiries about employee satisfaction and cultural sensitivity programs, clearly designed to probe the depth of Alexander's commitment to the values he claimed to embrace. The evening's climax arrived when Alexander, emboldened by what he mistakenly interpreted as Lin Shengming's approval, decided to demonstrate his linguistic sophistication by speaking directly in Mandarin about the quality of American service workers. His words, delivered with the smug satisfaction of someone showing off a party trick, carried a level of cultural condescension that would have been offensive in any language. The phrase he chose, describing American employees as requiring constant supervision due to their inherent lack of discipline, revealed everything about his worldview that he had spent the evening trying to conceal. Having delivered what he clearly considered a devastating critique, Alexander turned to Danny with the cruel smile of someone about to deliver a final humiliation. "Translate this properly," he commanded, his voice carrying the authority of someone accustomed to absolute obedience. "Tell him these American workers need discipline." The silence that followed Alexander's demand stretched like a held breath, every person in the room understanding that they had reached a moment of truth that would define everything that came after. Danny stood perfectly still, her dark eyes meeting Alexander's expectant gaze with an expression that combined dignity, intelligence, and something that might have been pity for his profound ignorance. When she spoke, her voice carried the clear, precise tones of someone who had spent years mastering not just the mechanics of language, but its cultural soul. "Mr. Lin," she said in flawless Mandarin that made the hired translator's efforts sound like kindergarten recitation, "I believe there has been a fundamental misunderstanding about the nature of this meeting." Her words continued in Chinese, each syllable pronounced with the authority of native fluency. as she began to systematically dismantle every lie Alexander had told over the course of the evening. The revelation that followed was surgical in its precision and devastating in its completeness. Danny presented the evidence she had gathered about Alexander's business practices. The inflated occupancy rates, the fabricated customer satisfaction scores, the pattern of overcharging international clients while delivering substandard service. Her Chinese was not merely fluent, but sophisticated, employing business terminology and cultural references that demonstrated a level of education and cultural understanding that made Alexander's own efforts seem laughably amateur by comparison. Lin Shengming's responses revealed his own fluency in English, his questions and comments making clear that he had understood every word of Alexander's racist commentary throughout the evening. The hired translator sat frozen in his chair, his services suddenly as irrelevant as Alexander's carefully prepared lies. Alexander's face cycled through expressions of shock, rage, and finally, desperate calculation as he realized that his entire evening had been an elaborate trap that he had walked into willingly. His attempts at damage control claims that Danny was a disgruntled employee spreading lies, suggestions that her translations were deliberately inaccurate, fell apart as Lin Shengming calmly produced his own recordings of the conversation. The Chinese businessman's revelation that he had been investigating Alexander's business practices for weeks added the final nail to the coffin of what had once seemed like a promising partnership. As security personnel appeared at the dining room's entrance, summoned by Lin Shengming's quiet phone call, Alexander finally understood that he had not been the hunter in this evening's drama. He had been the prey all along. The revelation that Lin Shengming had been recording their entire conversation hit Alexander like a physical blow, his face draining of color as he stared at the small digital device that the Chinese businessman placed deliberately on the table between them. "I make it a practice to document all business meetings," Lin Shengming explained, in perfect, unaccented English, his voice carrying the calm authority of someone who had planned this moment down to the smallest detail. "Particularly when I suspect that the other party may not be entirely forthcoming about their intentions or capabilities." The words hung in the air like a verdict, each syllable carefully chosen to maximize the impact on a man who had built his career on manipulating others through careful presentation and cultural assumptions. Alexander's hands trembled slightly as he reached for his wine glass, his usual composure cracking like ice under pressure as he began to understand the magnitude of his miscalculation. The evidence of Alexander's systematic deception was overwhelming, but Lin Shengming's presentation of it was methodical and devastating in its thoroughness. He had spent weeks investigating Alexander's business practices, consulting with former employees who painted a picture of workplace discrimination and financial irregularities that stretched back years. Customer reviews from international visitors revealed a consistent pattern of overcharging and substandard service, while financial documents obtained through legitimate business channels showed occupancy rates that fluctuated suspiciously depending on the audience being presented. Most damaging were testimonials from previous investors who described elaborate presentations that promised luxury experiences but delivered mediocre accommodations at premium prices. Lin Shengming's voice remained steady and professional as he outlined each piece of evidence, his tone suggesting disappointment rather than anger at Alexander's attempts to defraud him. Alexander's attempts at damage control were desperate and increasingly irrational, his explanations shifting from denial to blame as he realized that his carefully constructed facade was crumbling beyond repair. He accused Danny of industrial espionage, suggested that Lin Shengming had been fed false information by competitors, and finally resorted to claiming that cultural misunderstandings had distorted his innocent comments about employee management. Each excuse fell flatter than the last, his credibility eroding with every word as Lin Shengming calmly refuted his claims with documented evidence. The hired translator sat in stunned silence, his services no longer needed now that the pretense of linguistic barriers had been abandoned. The elegant dining room that had been designed to showcase Alexander's sophistication now felt like a courtroom where he was being tried and convicted by his own words. The business community's reaction was swift and merciless. Word of the failed dinner meeting spreading through Seattle's interconnected network of investors and entrepreneurs with the speed of wildfire in drought conditions. By morning, Alexander's phone was ringing constantly with calls from partners demanding explanations, investors questioning their commitments, and journalists seeking confirmation of rumors about discriminatory business practices and fraudulent marketing. The hotel chain that had been his pride and joy began experiencing immediate consequences as bookings were canceled and corporate contracts were terminated by companies that could not afford to be associated with publicly exposed racism. The financial markets that had once celebrated Alexander's expansion plans now viewed his empire as a liability, his stock price plummeting as investors fled towards safer investments that wouldn't damage their own reputations. Media coverage transformed the story from a simple business dispute into a symbol of justice served, with headlines celebrating the downfall of a hotel mogul whose arrogance had finally met its match. Local news stations picked up the story first, followed by national business publications that had been tracking Alexander's questionable practices for years, but had lacked the concrete evidence needed to publish their suspicions. The narrative that emerged was irresistible to journalists and readers alike. A racist billionaire humiliated by the very person he had tried to demean, his empire crumbling because he had underestimated the intelligence and dignity of someone he considered beneath him. Social media amplified the story beyond traditional news cycles, with videos of Alexander's past discriminatory behavior surfacing as former employees found the courage to speak publicly about their experiences. Lin Shengming's offer came the following afternoon, delivered in the same private dining room where Alexander's career had ended less than 24 hours earlier. The Chinese businessman's proposal was both generous and meaningful, a position as cultural liaison for his expanding network of international business ventures, with responsibilities that would utilize Danny's linguistic skills and cultural knowledge in service of building genuine bridges between communities rather than exploiting cultural differences for profit. The salary he quoted was more than triple what she earned as a waitress, enough to cover Maya's medical expenses immediately while providing the financial stability that had eluded their family for years. More importantly, the position offered respect, professional development, and the opportunity to use her education in service of values she could actually believe in, rather than compromising her integrity for survival. The contrast between Lin Shengming's approach and Alexander's manipulation could not have been more stark. The Chinese businessman's genuine interest in cultural exchange, serving as a reminder of what international business could accomplish when conducted with integrity and mutual respect. His questions about Danny's academic background revealed a sophisticated understanding of the challenges facing talented individuals whose circumstances had prevented them from pursuing their preferred career paths. The conversation that followed was conducted as equals, with Lin Shengming clearly viewing her intelligence and cultural knowledge as assets to be cultivated rather than tools to be exploited. His business philosophy emphasized long-term relationships built on trust and shared success, values that had guided his investment decisions for decades, and had made him one of the most respected figures in international commerce. Alexander's descent from respected businessman to industry pariah was swift and complete, his reputation destroyed by the very recording that was supposed to demonstrate his cultural sophistication and business acumen. Former partners distanced themselves from his projects, Investors demanded immediate repayment of loans, and the media scrutiny revealed additional instances of discriminatory behavior that had been overlooked or covered up during his years of success. The hotel chain, that had once been valued in the hundreds of millions, found itself facing bankruptcy as occupancy rates plummeted, and corporate clients canceled contracts that had taken years to negotiate. The empire he had built through manipulation and exploitation crumbled with the same ruthless efficiency that he had once applied to destroying his competitors, proving that systems built on injustice ultimately consume themselves. As the evening concluded with handshakes and promises of future collaboration, Danny allowed herself to feel something she had not experienced in years: hope for a future that extended beyond mere survival. Lin Shengming's offer represented more than just employment. It was validation that her talents and education had value in a world that often seemed designed to waste both. The recording device that had captured Alexander's downfall sat silent on the table between them, a reminder that justice, while sometimes delayed, could still be served when truth met power wielded with wisdom and integrity. 6 months later, Danny stood at the floor-to-ceiling windows of her new office overlooking Elliott Bay, watching the morning ferry traffic navigate between the islands that dotted Seattle's harbor like emeralds scattered across blue silk. The view was spectacular, but more important was what it represented: a life transformed by the courage to stand up for what was right when the cost of silence had finally become too high to bear. Her business cards now read Cultural Liaison, Lin Shengming International, a title that captured both her linguistic expertise and her role in building bridges between communities that had been separated by misunderstanding and prejudice. The work was challenging and meaningful, requiring her to travel between Seattle, Vancouver, and various Asian cities as she helped negotiate partnerships that respected cultural differences rather than exploiting them for profit. Maya's recovery had exceeded all ethical expectations, her surgery successful beyond the doctor's most optimistic projections, and her return to university studies a testament to the resilience that had carried their family through years of uncertainty. The medical bills that had once seemed insurmountable were now manageable thanks to Danny's new salary. But more importantly, Maya's future was secure in ways that had seemed impossible just months before. Her sister's pre-med program was thriving, her grades reflecting the brilliant mind that had never been diminished by her physical challenges, and her determination to become a doctor was fueled by gratitude for the care she had received and a desire to provide similar hope to other families facing medical crises. Their weekly phone calls were filled with excitement about internships and research opportunities rather than anxiety about bills and treatment schedules. The transformation of the Emerald Table under new management served as a daily reminder of how quickly institutions could change when leadership embraced values of equity and respect rather than exploitation and hierarchy. Lin Shengming had purchased the restaurant not as an investment, but as a demonstration project, transforming it into a worker-owned cooperative where former servers and kitchen staff now held ownership stakes and decision-making authority. The changes went beyond financial structure to include cultural sensitivity training, multilingual menus that celebrated the diverse backgrounds of both staff and customers, and a mission statement that emphasized community building over profit maximization. Danny visited occasionally for lunch meetings, always greeted warmly by former colleagues who had traded their uniforms for business casual attire that reflected their new roles as owners rather than employees. Alexander's fall from grace had been complete and irreversible. His hotel empire sold piece by piece to competitors who rebranded the properties and implemented the genuine cultural sensitivity programs that he had only pretended to value. Legal investigations revealed a pattern of discriminatory practices that resulted in substantial settlements for former employees who had endured years of workplace harassment and wage theft. The criminal charges were still pending, but his reputation was so thoroughly destroyed that even his former allies in Seattle's business community refused to associate with him publicly. Industry publications that had once celebrated his success now used his story as a cautionary tale about the dangers of letting prejudice and arrogance override basic business ethics as unknown and human decency. The scholarship program that Danny had established with her first year's bonus was already making a difference in the lives of multilingual students whose talents had been overlooked by traditional educational institutions. The fund specifically targeted individuals from disadvantaged backgrounds who demonstrated proficiency in languages other than English, providing not just financial support, but mentorship and internship opportunities that could transform their career trajectories. The first recipients included a Somali refugee whose Arabic and French skills made her invaluable for international NGO work, a Mexican-American student whose technical translation abilities opened doors in the aerospace industry, and a Vietnamese immigrant whose cultural knowledge proved essential for a tech company's expansion into Southeast Asian markets. Each success story validated Danny's belief that linguistic diversity was a community asset, rather than a barrier to be overcome. Lin Shengming's business philosophy had proven as profitable as it was ethical, his emphasis on authentic cultural exchange and mutual respect generating partnerships that delivered sustainable returns for all involved parties. The international ventures that Danny helped facilitate were models of cross-cultural collaboration, from eco-tourism projects in rural China that preserved traditional villages while providing economic opportunities to technology transfers that brought innovative agricultural techniques to farming communities across multiple continents. Her role in these negotiations went beyond simple translation to include cultural interpretation that helped prevent misunderstandings and build the trust necessary for long-term business relationships. The work was intellectually stimulating and morally satisfying in ways that her restaurant job had never been, utilizing her education and experience in service of goals she could genuinely support. The personal growth that accompanied her professional success was equally transformative, confidence replacing the defensive vigilance that had characterized her years of economic uncertainty and workplace discrimination. Public speaking engagements at business schools and professional conferences provided opportunities to share her story while advocating for more inclusive hiring practices and cultural competency training in international business. Her presentations always emphasized that diversity was not just a moral imperative, but a competitive advantage, that companies which genuinely valued different perspectives and experiences consistently outperformed those that merely paid lip service to inclusion. The positive reception of these talks led to consulting opportunities, with organizations seeking to improve their cross-cultural effectiveness and avoid the kind of spectacular failures that had destroyed Alexander's reputation. The evening light reflecting off Elliott Bay painted the office walls in shades of gold and rose as Danny reviewed applications for the latest round of scholarship recipients, each file representing a young person whose potential was waiting to be recognized and nurtured. The stories were heartbreakingly familiar: brilliant students working multiple jobs to support families, recent immigrants whose professional credentials weren't recognized in their new country, native speakers of languages that were desperately needed by employers who couldn't see past accents or unfamiliar names. Her selection process prioritized not just academic achievement, but resilience, cultural bridge-building potential, and commitment to using their opportunities to create positive change in their communities. The fund had grown beyond her initial contribution thanks to donations from other business leaders who recognized its value and wanted to support its mission. As she prepared to leave for the day, Danny reflected on the journey that had brought her from serving tables to sitting at them as an equal partner in international negotiations. The courage required to challenge Alexander's racism had seemed impossible at the time, but the consequences of that choice had created ripple effects that continued to generate positive change for countless others. Her success was not just personal vindication, but proof that justice, while sometimes delayed, remained possible when individuals chose integrity over security and community over self-preservation. The future stretched ahead, full of possibility. Each new project and partnership an opportunity to build the kind of world where talent was recognized regardless of its packaging, and where cultural differences were celebrated as sources of strength rather than barriers to be overcome.